we now have some specific context in Italy and nearby areas that fostered cultural change. In Podcast 10C, now we survey the main trends in literature, art, and learning that are usually labeled as the Renaissance. As we'll see, the Renaissance began on a small scale with new ideals in literary style. It expanded to include art, architecture, philosophy, and even politics. Above all, the Renaissance was about history, how people of the 15th century found and celebrated their roots, first in the pre-Christian Roman past, then in ancient Greece as well as Rome. The Renaissance began with many scattered cultural threads, but the first clear movement we link to it started in Florence in the 1340s. This was the height of disaster and disorder in Florence, and Florence was a town deeply affected, when a man named Petrarch organized a new circle of writers and teachers. These were not university professors. They were freelancers, children of the wealthy merchant class. Somewhat educated, they knew Latin, but beyond that they were self-educated, passing time away between their duties as secretaries, lawyers, or church officials. In this time of difficulty, the authors took solace in readings from the distant past. And the more they read of ancient Latin writing, the more they wanted to read. According to Petrarch, the Romans were just better writers of Latin, better poets, offering eloquent sentences and stanzas and imagery. Petrarch was annoyed by the mechanical way his contemporaries wrote Latin, without knowing the language well or seeing the beautiful turns of phrase. This is how humanism started, with aesthetic choices, judgments that old Latin was better than new. That's not where it ended. The more Petrarch and his friends read the Latin classics, the more they began to try to replicate their writing, to make references, allusions, to borrow phrases, to make comparisons between contemporary lives and culture and this Roman literary past. Now, this was not the first time Western Christians had borrowed from ancient Roman literature or admired ancient Roman writings. Scholars in the age of Charlemagne had admired some of these works already, and universities had been reading much of this stuff since the 12th century. But Petrarch and his friends were not in the universities. They were interested in bringing their discovery of ancient beauty to a wider audience. They wanted to reuse the Latin classics to educate others as well in those classics, to revive a sense of beauty in contemporary writing. Most importantly, Petrarch and his friends wanted to revive a sense of Roman virtue. This was more controversial than just style. But Petrarch claimed that the pre-Christian Romans had something to offer him and his fellow Florentines, models of behavior, a measure of what was possible. In this world of city-states, Petrarch and his friends liked reading about an ancient city-state that won the world, so to speak, and had enabled the spread of Christianity. Sure, the Romans had been polytheists, but now Romans were declared honorary Christians because they had prepared the way for Christianity. Such was the focus of the first humanist writers in Florence, and the trend spread then to other Italian cities. Attention turned among the merchant classes and bureaucratic classes back to ancient Rome, to Roman poetry, history, culture. By the 15th century, though, this trend had expanded in an important way. Writers started looking to ancient Greece as well, Greek authors and Greek language, which meant learning the Greek language, something few of these bureaucrats, and even few in the universities, had done. Partly this interest in Greek culture stemmed out of reading Roman Latin literature. After all, Romans themselves spoke about the Greeks and their admiration of learning and writing from Greek tradition. It was a small step to reading the Greeks directly. But the bigger factor encouraging Greek interest was actual Greeks, so to speak. I mean Byzantine scholars in Italy, there as traders and diplomats, and then, after the mid-15th century, as refugees. The scholars, by and large, came through Venice first, and brought along their books. They provided more instruction in Greek, and touted the value of the original wisdom that Greek tradition offered, which Latins had merely borrowed. One of the most famous examples was the philosopher George Gemistos Plethon, whom we mentioned before. By the 1440s, Greek tradition was nearly as important in Florence as Roman tradition. The government of Florence was even inspired by Plethon to found a Platonic academy, that was intended to take up some of the ideas and teach the Greek language, bringing it to bear on present situations. But probably most important, we must keep in mind, is the sense that Greek and Roman tradition were linked. Writers of the Renaissance saw these as both pieces of a classical past, which humanists wanted to revive. Then there's one more piece to the cultural trend we must note: the desire to expand classical wisdom beyond Greek and Latin. It was nothing new for Christian scholars to study the Latin past, and even the Greek past was read by a few university scholars. What was new was the desire to consistently put this wisdom, as they saw it, into widely accessible form. Petrarch and his friends first wrote in Latin, but by the later 14th century, humanist writers were doing what Boccaccio did. They were writing in the everyday language of Florence, Tuscan, or what we now largely know as Italian. And they were working to make this everyday vernacular speech more beautiful, more classical, more influenced by the ancient learning and style. The Renaissance was a period of frequent translation, translating Latin writings and Roman stories into Italian. Don't get me wrong, there had been prior writing in Italian by lawyers and poets and chroniclers, but not with the same polish or focus on classical models. Again, the goal was to spread the word, to get others to see ancient beauty that Petrarch and the humanists saw, to use Latin wisdom in contemporary life, to change the way people spoke of their own lives, to give them a new sense of virtue. The Renaissance began with these humanist writers. By the 15th century, the trend had moved beyond writing. Artists and architects began to take interest in Greek and Roman classical culture as well. Italy was dotted with thousands of visible ruins of classical buildings, each holding a smattering of statues. Artists had long known about all this, but starting around 1400, the artists began to see this material as a model for beauty, balance, and style. Medieval art suddenly looked shabby by comparison, and a push was on to make the Christian art just as beautiful as classical Greek and Roman art had been, to use the old art and architecture to glorify the Christian present. In architecture, this trend took the form of reusing old techniques for building well-balanced arches, colonnades, vaulted roofs, and especially domes. Renaissance architects looked through the ruins for clues about how to make these forms. Since the 12th century, architects had built up enormous technical skill with Gothic cathedrals. Now they put the skill to use in classical styles, for clearly Christian purposes in most cases. A good example would be the Cathedral of Florence. This long-running building project needed a central roof to be finished. The town held a competition for designs, and the winner was an architect named Filippo Brunelleschi, who promised to design a Roman-style freestanding dome. Brunelleschi spent months in Rome examining old domed buildings and figuring out ways to do this. His dome was completed by the 1430s, and Roman style was thus being used to glorify God. In art, Renaissance trends took the form of a revival of classical art forms, such as perspective landscape, balanced pictures, and celebration of the human form. Painters and sculptors examined thousands of old statues of emperors and gods, mosaics, and other kinds of mythical scenes. They used these styles to depict scenes from the Bible, from biblical or later Christian characters, and so on. A famous example is certainly Michelangelo Buonarroti, the sculptor and painter, with his deep interest in getting the muscles right on his male heroes, and his famous nude statue of David looking like a proud hero again. Probably the most famous example. Again, we see ancient style used to glorify Christian tradition. Of course, not all art projects could be described this way. More direct copying or riffing on old mythological scenes is seen in the work of, for instance, Sandro Botticelli, who at the time, when he produced his famous painting, The Birth of Venus, was rather annoyed with church leaders. He later had something of a personal conversion experience and turned to more Christian subject matters. But here he used ancient tradition to express his frustration with that Christian leadership. Renaissance trends thus began in both art and writing with that interest in ancient style and beauty. This was certainly not the end. Reviving these forms and stories and styles ended up changing the content of what people wrote about, what they studied. And this included the obvious. More study of the classical past meant more knowledge of Greek and Roman myth and Greek and Roman history. It meant more references, more pictures of these topics, more allusions. Comparisons were constant. Interest also spread to the learning contained in ancient texts in reviving long-lost traditions. As we'll see, this may be an overstatement. The Renaissance revived interest in philosophy in a wider scope, though. Now, since the 12th century, Aristotle had been very popular as a philosophic writer in the universities of Latin Christendom. He remained so in some circles. But we also see revivals in other schools of philosophy from the ancient world, especially interest in Plato. This was aided by the influx of new Greek philosophic texts from Byzantium, who remained admirers of Plato. Renaissance scholars also revived interest in what we would call science, what they called natural philosophy. In this case, both old Greek traditions and the findings of the Islamic world played a key role. Medicine, optics, biology all received new attention. So did geometry and algebra. Partly this drive was tied to humanist notions that human wisdom was as worthy to study as theology, that one could discover real truths about the workings of the world, and even God, as some ancient Greeks and Romans had done. Along with interest in the natural science goes a deep interest in what we today might call pseudoscience or occult sciences, magical methods of discovering hidden truth. This was a time when Christian writers took interest in other forms of mystical wisdom from Jewish and Islamic traditions, and especially from the Greek and Roman past. Ways of telling the future from palms or the bumps on the head, phrenology. These arts also included alchemy, the search for methods of turning various metals into gold. We know that these methods were failures, but the Renaissance people didn't know that. To them, these were possible routes to hidden wisdom worth trying. And what is striking here in this realm, in the natural sciences and what we might label pseudosciences, we see wide communication with and borrowing from Eastern Christian and Islamic scholarly traditions. Renaissance interest in reviving the classics affected the search for knowledge. It also affected the way learned classics expressed their family values, what they claimed as proper models for running a family, for behavior for men, women, and children, all of which came, to some extent, out of their reading of ancient philosophy. Now, throughout the medieval period, one main guide to proper moral life had been the Christian Bible, and Christian works based on the Bible. Think of Duoda's advice and how she claimed that the family structure was put in place by God. Stress was thus laid on monogamy, humility, charity, and the like. The only other main guide had been what you might call feudal custom, the codes of behaviors and values that lords used, stressing the importance of family loyalty, and we might also add the codes of chivalry that had developed in connection with the Peace of God movement. In the 15th century, we see a new vein in the writings of humanists. Some things were unchanged. Stress on family loyalty remained. But we see less interest in humility, more emphasis on pride. Above all, we see a shift from advice that drew on the Bible to advice that drew on Greek and Roman models of behavior. These writers advised families not so much to follow God's advice, but to cultivate natural virtues, to follow the basic good patterns of proper life as they saw it as being true for all humans, and especially to follow the Romans as a good guide to natural virtue. We'll be reading a sample of such familial advice, the work of Leon Battista Alberti. Alberti was a monk, a celibate man, a church employee, a secretary to several popes. On the side, he wrote books about all sorts of things included in family life, and his advice is intriguing. It's not anti-Christian, not at all. It reinforces a lot of existing patterns of late medieval family life, but it makes very little reference to the Bible or Christian writings at all. The preferred models of ideal behavior were shifting, even for a church employee. Renaissance writers offered new guidance for family life. Most strikingly, they offered new guidance about politics. At the heart, the Renaissance was a way to view the historical past, the classical past, then the Dark Ages, then the revival of ancient virtue. Writers looked deeply at political changes, at the rise of city-states in Greece and Rome, the creation of big empires, the creation of messy, scattered medieval kingdoms, and finally, for Italians, the return to city-states, including several sorts of governments, monarchies, theocracies, republics, and so on. Renaissance political writers theorized about these processes, about which states worked well and why. They debated what political systems from the past might work best in their own day. Most importantly, the theorists talked about political community, the notion of citizenship, the idea that people should identify with their city, or maybe with something larger. The best-known political writer of the Renaissance is a relatively late figure, Niccolò Machiavelli, who lived and worked as a city bureaucrat and wrote in Florence in the early 16th century. Machiavelli was a careful student of Roman history. He admired the Roman Republic. He drew all sorts of advice from ancient Roman politics to guide the Republic of Florence. But his was not a rigid ideology. His main goal was to see a successful state, a successful society, and success for his own family. When Florence became a monarchy around 1520, he was happy to advise its prince how to succeed and keep power. And his advice often contradicted basic concepts of Christian morality. Machiavelli is probably most famous for the idea that the end justifies the means. The only problem is he never actually wrote this line. What he did say was, keep in mind the end, keep in mind the larger goal. One should be willing to do things, he argued, that momentarily seem wrong if the outcome would be better for the community as a whole. That is, personal morality is not the same thing as what is morally good for the political community. Machiavelli is also important for another reason, his vision of what politics could be. By the late 15th century, Italian city-states were in some trouble. They faced wars with larger outside powers such as France and Spain. Machiavelli wanted Italians to think about themselves as a community, as a nation. They may have a bunch of independent cities, but those cities should be able to act in the interest of the nation of Italy, a group of people that had roots, Machiavelli thought, in the Roman past. Machiavelli was not always popular in his own day. His advice was troubling, and after his death he was declared dangerous by the church. His writings were banned. But many of his ideas had a long-term backroom influence. So I hope you now have some sense of where this Renaissance trend came from and what it constituted in terms of literature, art, and thinking. Let me finish this podcast by returning to a question we've pondered several times. How can we put this in larger context? What else was going on in the wider Mediterranean? Now, the Renaissance in Italy was hardly the only flourishing of interest in wisdom in a distant past, or the only flourishing of new styles and new ways of viewing society in the Mediterranean world. The Italian Renaissance drew most directly on trends in Christian Byzantium. Byzantium was having its own growing interest in humanism, its own interest in the Roman and Greek past. Since the 12th century, it had hosted writers looking for models of art, politics, philosophy, and virtue in those ancient literary pasts. It was Byzantine scholars like Platon and others who left before and after the fall of Constantinople that expanded humanists' interest in Italy from ancient Rome to include both Rome and ancient Greece. Byzantine scholars penned political advice as historical and as incisive as Machiavelli's. Platon's own lectures in Florence in the 1430s arguably made it possible for someone like Machiavelli to write his own theories 80 years later. But even these links to Byzantium are just part of the wider story, because the Islamic world had its own traditions of humanism and philosophy, with broad interests in learning. Philosophic interest was a long-running matter in the Islamic world. Humanist writers were especially common in Persian literature. Persian writers produced epic poetry that celebrated the pre-Islamic Persian past. Persian writers also continued a rich vein of storytelling, love poetry, mysticism, and philosophy. By the 15th century, Turkish was also becoming a language for some literature, poetry, and chronicles and the like. And of course, many Greek philosophic works rediscovered in Italy were long known to Muslims. By far the most famous Muslim scholar of this period now is Ibn Khaldun. He was a teacher of Islamic law who also studied and taught all sorts of other skills and bodies of knowledge. He was a real Renaissance man, so to speak. Ibn Khaldun wrote a work that we'll sample in a brief form, the Muqaddimah, or Introduction to History. This was a careful analysis of forces that had shaped human societies, and especially the workings of politics in Islamic states. It was a mix of history, political theory, and sociology rolled into one. Ibn Khaldun certainly had good things to say about Islamic faith, but his explanations relied on lots of more mundane factors, exploring the way dynasties rose to power through invasions or calls to unity, how they lasted or declined, how they won or lost popularity. His views differ in many ways from Machiavelli, though not in all ways, but they were just as sharp. And we have to keep in mind the timing. Ibn Khaldun wrote his work in the 1370s, 130 years before Machiavelli. Nor was Ibn Khaldun the only kind of Islamic scholar. Indeed, other philosophers often saw Ibn Khaldun as old-fashioned, far from the cutting edge. In the 14th and 15th century Islamic states, many people with varied interests, as varied as Italian humanists, could be found. Natural philosophers, occultist mystics, free-spirited seekers of beauty and love. The Islamic world of literature and learning was every bit as varied as the Christian one, and often interested in some of the same sources, hidden wisdom, especially virtue, from an ancient, even pre-Islamic past. There were few direct influences from the Islamic world on Italian humanists. Italian humanists had little contact with Arabic or Persian. They could only read older Islamic works, like those of Ibn Sina, that had been translated into Latin. But indirect links existed, which could pass on general ideas. The Italian Renaissance, it turns out, is only one part of a wider set of Christian and Islamic trends propagating across the 14th and 15th centuries.